All right, ladies, we are now live. Thank you so much, Grace, for doing some troubleshooting behind the scenes. Good afternoon, and welcome to the special edition of Talk on Race Domestic Violence. As usual, we're going to start with our land acknowledgement. The Lower Cape Fear of the YWCA serves the people located within the Lower Cape Fear region. This land once thrived with life from indigenous peoples, known today as the Cape Fear Indians and the Womxn Indian people, living in established settlements along the Cape Fear River and Lake Waccamaw, along with many other established sites in the region. We need to protect and honor the history of these places. Indigenous peoples are not relics of the past. They are still here, continuing to demonstrate their talents and gifts amidst a backdrop of ongoing colonialism and oppression. They are worth celebrating. We hope our land acknowledgement statement will inspire others to stand in solidarity with us and with Native nations. So good evening again. I would love for everyone to unmute themselves and just go ahead and introduce yourself, and we'll start with Miss Andrea.
Hi, I'm Andrea Stowe. I am the Residential Services Director at Domestic Violence Shelter and Services here in New Hanover County. I've been in that position since January 1st. Prior to that, for about 10 years, I was our outreach coordinator / advocate, which just means I've gotten to do a little bit of everything that our agency has to offer. And thank you for having us.
Thank you so much for being here. Okay, Miss Amber.
Hi, my name is Amber Burgin. I am a batterer intervention specialist living in Rougemont, North Carolina. Originally from Durham, used to live in Wilmington. I specialize in working with the perpetrator of domestic violence and not the victim, which is a very rare group of people in North Carolina who work with these people. So we specialize in anger management, domestic violence, and we also teach sex offender counseling group classes.
Thank you so much, Amber, for joining us. And then we have Amy.
Hi, my name is Amy White. I'm an assistant district attorney here in New Hanover County. So I work for Ben David. I am the felony domestic violence or family violence prosecutor. So I'm assigned to the family violence or homicide prevention unit. I've been a prosecutor for about 5 years here. But I'm from Wilmington, and my first job was at the YWCA. So I'm happy to be back in a different sort of role.
Yes, and actually Lance told us today that you and him used to work together and that he worked with you right before you were going to law school. So thank you for coming back.
Thanks.
Thank you. So we are going to jump right in. And also anyone who is viewing with us, you are welcome to send us your questions and we'll try to answer them. Okay, so let's talk about what is domestic violence and how do we know that it's happening? I guess my first thoughts would be, when you see women with black eyes or you hear couples fighting, that is an example of domestic violence. But I also feel like that may be a surface level of examples. So I would love to kind of get for you to tell me more about what is domestic violence and what do we see?
So I love that you brought that up. I think we are at a disadvantage sometimes because we go to the Lifetime movie version of what domestic violence is, and what it is a pattern of abuse and control, power and control over another person that somebody in a relationship asserts. And I think the hard part is when we don't talk about those other things like emotional abuse, verbal abuse, financial abuse, and all of those different pieces that happen. Somebody who really could benefit from having that support doesn't see themselves in that definition. And I think that's really important that we keep that definition really broad so that people understand that that support is for them as well.
Yeah, and you said financial abuse. What does that look like?
That can take on many different things, and you guys jump into I'm passionate, so I'll keep talking. But we do have a range of different things. We have abusive partners that will take somebody's paycheck or take control over the finances or not allow that person to work, or if they are at work, really poisoning that environment for them or trying to get them actively fired or really interfering with their ability to get that job done. And there's a lot of loss of productivity in our workforce. And there's a big economic impact that domestic violence has that we don't talk enough about.
Wow. Okay. Okay. Go
One
ahead.
thing I think that's important to note about domestic violence too is that there's no one type of victim that you're looking for or offender. It really affects all walks of life. In my caseload, I see people from all socioeconomic backgrounds, ages, races, ethnicities. I mean, we prosecute domestic violence coming from like homeless encampments, but also in landfall. So you really have a broad range of who this issue affects.
Wow. Okay. Okay.
I would love to add to that and say, as a reminder, that we often assume that the offender is typically a male. But what we want to remember is that we also, domestic violence also constitutes families, not just male and female. So mothers, sons, fighting fathers, sisters, family units that are in turmoil, typically with manipulation, physical violence, things like that. But also making sure that we don't forget our LGBTQIA friends who are also suffering with domestic violence as well.
Yes, yes. Thank you all. I think that you're right. I think most people have like this kind of hallmark view of what domestic violence is. I mean, how do people know if they're in a domestic violence situation? Like, how can they identify that? If they're like, well, he's not hitting me, so I'm not necessarily being abused, but what are some of the other clues that women and men and people can know that they are actually in an abusive situation?
I think one of the most important things is recognizing their own autonomy and are they allowed to be their own person? We see so many different methods of control and power, and always, it can look very different from a lot of different people. Something that impacts me very deeply may not impact the other person. And that's what makes that abuser so effective, is that they know those things because they're, somebody that you're very intimate with, you're in a household with. So I think it's asking yourself, like, how do you feel when you go home? Is there a sense of dread? Or when you're with this person, are you feeling that sense of anxiety? Are you, finding your fight or flight mechanism kick in for your nervous system? And those are important things to really get back to. And that's difficult for people in those relationships because they've been told not to trust their own self and their own instincts. So I think a lot of it is really recognizing how that other person or that abusive partner really impacts them and their ability to live, make decisions. Do they feel safe having a voice in a relationship and saying no, or saying this is what I want? And that can be really difficult.
I think some red flags we see are, isolation is typically pretty common. Jealousy, suspicion. Those are all sorts of identifiable red flags.
And Amber, in your line of work, how do abusers recognize that they are abusing?
Well, interestingly enough, they typically don't. A lot of times when we think about abusers and people who participate in violence in relationships, they're usually considering themselves the victim. And so they oftentimes say, well, I was responding to the way that you made me feel, instead of taking accountability for their own feelings. So oftentimes we find that our offenders, when they get to us, are in denial about being considered an abuser and are constantly looking for a way to put the blame on someone else. But when you talk with them and you ask them, do you think it's okay for you to hit this person? Do you think it's okay for you to be violent? We typically get back, well, if they hadn't done what they did first, I would not have had to do that, because they're very much steeped in this reality of power and control.
Wow. Wow. Okay. Someone said, well said. Well said. So people are listening and learning. Can you talk about what ways people can support others that they see in a domestic violence relationship or situation? How do friends support? If you're in high school and you see your friend coming to school with a black eye, or you see your friend who used to be very outgoing is no longer outgoing and is kind of withdrawn. How do you respond when you're sitting at Thanksgiving? This is pre-COVID, right? When you're sitting at Thanksgiving with your family and you hear that abusive kind of control, manipulative language. How do people, what is the best response to kind of help some situations that we see?
I just love that you covered all of those kind of grounds. I know that from very young and all the way up, we talk a lot about bystander intervention. And I think for a lot of people, when we think, oh, supporting someone, it means, putting yourself physically in the middle of something. And that's not always safe. And it's also not always where that person is ready to go with it. And so I think it's really important. Yeah, if you care about the person, or even if you don't, making sure that you don't overstep and become the abusive person by taking power and control away from that person in the situation. But we teach the 3 Ds sometimes, and it's distract, delegate, and of course, I can't remember the last one. But our kids are really good at it. And we did a lot of programming with younger people on how to model their own language and make sure if somebody is making, because it is a spectrum. And I love that we talked about accountability earlier, because when the earlier you hold someone accountable, they learn that those behaviors are not okay. So being able to say, that's not a funny joke, or, hey, we don't talk to people that way. And it's particularly effective when it's the abusive partners, people, family and friends, and people that they respect speaking up. We have a local initiative with A Call to Men, who's a national organization, but we're very lucky to have one of their key partners or trainers here locally. So even on the sporting fields, boys, girls, males, females, just really holding people accountable for how they act and what they say, and making sure that we know that everyone has a right to feel valued and feel a sense of who they are. And so that's really important. It's a great question and a great conversation.
Yeah. Amber?
I was going to say, one of the things that I have learned from my clients is how often we don't talk about the accountability, mutual respect, and the ways in which we talk about the system of patriarchy, or don't talk about it and instead participate in it, and how deeply rooted some of the beliefs that people have about violence are. And oftentimes those relationships about violence are supported by some of the actions that we don't even consider violence, but because we allow that to be perpetuated in our society, it creates a space for justification. So things like video game violence is an easy way for people to passively decide that violence is acceptable in certain situations. The ways in which we feel or experience the ideas of sports, physical aggression when we're coaching children about how to play games. Those different kinds of areas don't separately translate from the court to the house. And so if you've got a coach that is really a bully and we're calling that coaching, what we're teaching children is that it's okay for people to speak to you that way. And in turn, it's okay for you to speak to others that way. Oftentimes we don't think about the role that women play in supporting other women to remain in situations of violence. And that has a lot to do with the fact that when we're all raised in the system of patriarchy, we're all instituted in some of these belief systems. And so while we may see that something is going on, oftentimes we ourselves are taught, don't get involved. And particularly from a cultural perspective, certain groups of people are most definitely taught that you have to mind your business. Yes. I know that in the Black community, particularly in the Black church,
what happens in our house stays in our house.
And that doesn't just include mom's business. It includes if mom gets hit, if I get hit, if someone else in the family is abusive or an alcoholic, substances that people see. And so all of these things contribute to the environment of violence that people passively allow to continue because it's always been a part of the tradition of the culture.
I also think that we talk a lot about behaviors being wrong, but we'll say things like don't hit or don't call names, but we don't teach young people and even our adults what to do because those feelings are very normal and healthy. Anger is a healthy emotion, but we demonize it instead of saying, okay, you have your heart's racing, you feel like a volcano is about to erupt. What do you do with that? And instead we have people walking around with that with no toolbox on how to express that or how to really do the things they need to heal or be healthy. And so then we're surprised later on in life when they still don't have those skills because it hasn't been ingrained. And I know there's agencies like the YWCA and a lot of our community partners really teaching that. And I think that's where that change can start to happen.
Yeah.
You know, for so many of our families, they're in trauma mode, they're in survival mode. They've experienced a range of different things. And like you said, if we don't really find a way to help all of us cope with that. I mean, you look at COVID-19 right now, you just see people really without a really good toolbox to handle all of this. So yeah.
And
one of the things that we teach in our class is that anger is a secondary emotion. A lot of times, particularly with my male group, we talk about the ways in which we don't allow men to be sad. We don't allow men to be embarrassed. We don't allow men to be angry without there being some type of aggressive power move so that anger doesn't feel like a weakness. It feels like a strength. And a lot of that is something that people have never been given a toolkit for, like she was saying. And so they're oftentimes surprised that there's an alternative. And so I definitely think it's important that we start providing people with alternatives and support the idea that masculinity doesn't have to include power and control.
Yeah, and honestly, Amber, something you taught me when my son was in the tantrums. I mean, he just was having bad tantrums and I did not know what to do. You know, like he just was mad because he couldn't get his way. And Amber was like, grab his hands, bend down, look him eye to eye, and have a conversation with him. And like still to this day, when he is frustrated or angry, we will grab each other's hands, we take a deep breath, we breathe. And like I didn't realize, even as a parent of a small child, that these small tools that we are giving our children, as he ages and grows up, if he gets angry, he knows like I need to stop, I need to take a breath, I need to maybe talk through it. So, you know, these tools are very important. And I hope somebody takes that tool and uses it because it's worked for me.
Yeah, it definitely works.
What are some of the reasons that abusers go back to, victims go back to their abusers?
So one of the things I always said for 10, 15 years of working in here, it was the most frustrating question when anybody asked me why somebody went back. Because the reality is all of those things make sense. We don't ask why someone feels it's okay to do these things, but we place that all back on the person. And I've watched people walk away ready to make a change, and really systems aren't always set up to make that change successful. You know, there's not affordable housing. I don't know if there's any anywhere, but particularly in Wilmington, I couldn't do what we've asked so many people that have just experienced trauma to do. We don't have, you know, available childcare subsidies. We don't have all the pieces in place to make it so that that person can successfully leave and still be safe. And so instead, I always look at it as if the person made that decision to go back, it's maybe the first decision they made without somebody, you know, really forcing them to. And that might be empowering in and of itself as well. But there's so many systematic things that really stand in the way that sometimes that decision makes the most sense. And as we all know, when someone's bent on having power and control, you take that away by leaving. That's a really dangerous time. You also look at it as most people leave after an incident. And so you're not thinking with the thinking part of your brain. You are on survival mode. So you haven't maybe thought through, kids still have to go to school tomorrow morning. I have to find somewhere to sleep. You just flee, or you just do what you need to do in that moment. So sometimes we as a community have worked on a lot of resiliency models. And one of the things I love about it was Tend and Befriend was named as a survival mode of getting that person, you know, just taking care of that person, even if they're hurting you, so that you can make it through. So I think that judgment needs to be shifted to, why does someone think it's okay to do these things?
Yeah, I think that is a great point. Like, the kids do have to go to school tomorrow. You have to potentially go to work tomorrow. The car note is still due. The rent is still due. You still have to have a roof over your head. The kids are still going to be hungry. You're still going to be hungry. And there's a litany of questions, ideas, things that have to be done. And so I think that I definitely, if I ask that question again, I will rephrase it, because I think that it doesn't do justice to the abuser or the victim, because life is still happening. It's not just this one occurrence. Amy, did you have a response?
I was just going to say the same thing as Andrea, really, but the thing with that really changes, because so in our office we have the domestic violence unit, but we also have violent crimes, and they're both violent acts that are traumatic and happen to someone. But the way we have to treat them is very different, because the victims I deal with, they have children with their partner, they own property together, their finances are together, they've maybe been isolated from their friends and family for years now. And so they're dealing with more complex emotions than someone who is maybe robbed or assaulted by a stranger. You don't have that same emotional connection and that same history and those same barriers that Andrea was just talking about. So it's just very different than most violent crimes.
Yeah, it's very complex. While we're talking about just that law side, can you talk to us a little bit about restraining orders? And so I know, you know, I'm a little surface level on this. So of course, you type in domestic violence, the first thing that pops up between Facebook, Google, and TikTok are like a litany of stories. I know I'm on TikTok now. Blame my sisters. It's a litany of stories about women being stalked or men being stalked, about how they have filed restraining orders and, you know, nothing is happening, or they still feel like the restraining order is not going to keep them safe. So can you start from the basics? So what is the purpose of the restraining order?
Sure. So a restraining order, is a civil order. So it's not something that I can assist with, but a violation of it is a criminal offense. But what it is someone being ordered that because of their relationship and that there's a history of violence and that they're in immediate danger, a judge has deemed that they need to be separate and that this offender cannot be near this victim. So, you know, they're an important tool. They're not, you know, a balm for everything. They're not perfect. Things can still happen, but they're very important. They're a public record so that law enforcement can access that. If there's any, if someone were to call 911, law enforcement can immediately see, oh, they have a restraining order against this person. That's important for them to know. They bar offenders. So if someone takes out a restraining order against someone, the person, the defendant, the abuser, is barred from owning a firearm during the length of that time, which it's a felony in North Carolina. It's also a federal violation. So that's pretty big. It's which I think, you know, so not to discount them, but I think it's important for us to be able to see the history of the relationship. I think it's important for law enforcement to be able to see that that's out there. It's an important investigative tool. It is an arrestable offense. So there is some weight to it in North Carolina. It's not a civil violation where the plaintiff or the victim then has to go to court and kind of manage it on her. I say her, on her own, but it provides that criminal remedy as well.
And Amber, do restraining orders frustrate abusers?
No, they love them. No. they absolutely, for what I find very interesting is that for a lot of people who don't understand why they have a restraining order, it becomes an additional agitation, particularly for people who already own firearms, persons who are considered influential in the community, have high-paying jobs, really struggle with the civil thing because that's something that can be checked on a background check. And so if they're not fully understanding that their behavior is inappropriate, oftentimes what is meant to be a protection for a person oftentimes for some people becomes a provoking act where they feel like they have to retaliate. And this is when something that is civil becomes criminal for a lot of people because they're unable to resist the impulse to respond to something that they feel is a threat to them.
And I think Amber really does a great job highlighting why when we are supporting someone going through this, we have to really be respectful that they are the expert of their own lives and their own relationships. So they will know, and a lot of times, will that be something that is a deterrent or will that be an agitator? And so I think sometimes agencies or friends and family and support want to say, well, you have to get a protective order. And the reality is it's a great tool. It's a tool that you can use when you're ready to use it because you have to be the one reporting the violations. You have to stay on top of those things. And there will be, in a lot of cases, violations, and it's on you to enforce those. And so I think it's so important, and I love that she pointed that out, that people respond differently. And so you have to listen to the person in that relationship who can really tell you what's going to work to keep them safe. It would be great if we were all experts and could figure all this out, but we're not. We're just there to help guide that. So yeah, it was such a great point.
Yeah, and I guess you know, I think that would be like the first thing that I would think people would do would be to get a restraining order. But I do not understand that the issue of restraining orders is more complex because yes, you want to have the paper trail to kind of support you from the law side, but also you never know what that particular person will know what the abuser's reaction is going to be. And, you know, it could be like, okay, this person understands now and will stop, or it could be kind of like, you know, it's just adding fuel to the fire. One of the things that also made me just kind of take a second glance were the numbers of reported and unreported, which I don't know how you get a number for unreported, but it's okay, of domestic violence cases in the LGBTQAI community. And I think most people would think abuse happens between a husband and a wife or a male and a female, but they don't necessarily expand their mind to think that domestic violence, again, happens across the board. One thing that I did see though was that a lot of times people in the LGBTQIA community are afraid to report, don't feel comfortable in reporting domestic violence, sexual assault, abuse in general. So I kind of wanted you to explain to me and some of the viewers, you know, what are some of the barriers and what are some of the maybe possible negative experiences that you've heard about as to why they haven't, and maybe what we can do to move forward?
So I'll share one or two experiences over the years that I've, you know, been able to see where those things can really go horribly wrong or go really well. One was we had someone who was afraid that our agency wouldn't support them if we knew they were in a same-sex couple. So they just made up an abuser and went that whole yard. But in the meantime, we weren't able to effectively help that person plan for their safety. And it eventually did come out, and it was very relieving to her that we wouldn't, you know, discriminate or we provide the same level of services. But that's a real fear that I think a lot of people have of, will this agency, will the staff members there, what are their mindsets? Will they be a supportive, welcoming environment? And so I think that was a real challenge. We also had it where we had a client who was married in a same-sex relationship, but the person didn't know that when they went to file the protective order. And so for some different relationships, it's very specific. If you're not living together or haven't lived together at the time, and it could probably is the same. If you're in, it says it has to be members of an opposite sex. And so the person went down there to file a protective order, like, oh, this isn't for you. And I couldn't even, there's no words to make that better for someone. There's no way to say that we don't treat everyone and want everyone to be valued and respected. There was nothing you could say to just tell, like, that person was broken, and they were married, they were able to file it, but it didn't even matter at that point. That just didn't feel like something for that person. And so I think that's on all of us as a community, as systems, to make sure that we're making those spaces and making those spaces somewhere that someone can really reach out to. But I get it. You know, in a shelter environment, you may be afraid that that person is reached out, and this happens in all different relationships, and claim to be the victim. I think Amber said it well. A lot of abusers think they're the victim, so they've already called and tried to access services. There's a lot of complications there, but I love that we're having the conversation, because I think we don't have it enough. And then again, it's like the same thing before. If you don't see yourself as part of that population, you're not going to ask for help if you don't see that you have an avenue for change. And so that's a great topic to have, but those barriers and those fears are very real.
Can I add to that?
Yes, please.
One of the things that I find with my LGBTQ clientele is that typically by the time someone ends up in my class by a court order, it's because both parties have gotten to a place where they've both been physically violent with one another. And a lot of times what I hear and understand is that part of the reason why no one says anything is because the community itself is so self-protective that when it comes to the idea of kicking someone out or canceling them, there's already so much that has been stigmatized about their community that they're so tight-knit that it almost feels like you're selling someone out because they're having a problem. And so oftentimes by the time it gets to me, one or both parties has had the police called on them. Both parties sometimes are both being charged because of an incident. One person may end up in the domestic violence perpetrator class and the other person ends up in substance abuse class. And so there's a lot of pieces that deal with guilt and shame that make it difficult for people to be willing to come forward. But in addition to that, I think, as Andrea was saying, the way sometimes people have encounters with the police during the time of the incident also makes it very difficult for people to want to file a report, particularly when we're working with untrained police officers who are not trained in how to approach a domestic violence situation. We're not trained in understanding how to deal with same-gender relationships in a domestic violence situation. And so several of my clients have come in and said, the officer, because I was dressed more like a boy, decided that I was the boy and I was the more violent person and arrested me and let my partner go because she was femme. I've had clients who are transgender women who are put in the male classes because the officer that arrested them wrote male on their documentation. And then when they show up for the assessment and I realize that this person identifies as a woman, having to go back to the court order and fight having to put that person in the other course because of the way that they identify themselves versus the way that the court system has treated them. And so when you have situations like that going on, one of the things that it reminds me is that every person can be a victim of something and a perpetrator of something at the same time. And so part of the reason I think that there are so few people who do the work that I do is because as a society, we struggle with the ability to see people as equals even in a terrible situation. And so when we think about what it means to care for victims, the person who's perpetrating violence was a victim of something that caused them to believe that violence was the way to handle it. And so part of the work that I do is to not necessarily agree that they are the victim in the situation that they have participated in, but to help them see that they got there in a way that they were victimized somewhere else. 90% of the people who participate in domestic violence were either physically abused or sexually abused sometime in their life before they became an offender of violence. And so it's really important for me as a therapist to remember that while someone may come into my office with a sexual violence or a physical violence crime, something happened to them. And for as much as we work on making sure that victims receive services, we have to do the equal amount of work to make sure that our perpetrators are getting the help that they need so that they don't continue to be a perpetrator.
I think Amber says something very powerful. I think a lot of times we have in the past focused most of our prevention and all of those efforts on potential victims or victims when you don't tell a robbery victim, you could do this better and just robbery will go away. It doesn't make any sense.
That is true.
And
can't argue with that.
And we have a really awesome offender program here as well. And, putting that work in is tough and it's often a lonely road, but it is important. And the reality also that you mentioned is there's often, even for a victim or survivor, they've maybe done something on the power and control wheel, or they've had a situation where they've reacted like that. And so what they do matters and how they do that. We talk a lot about really looking at who's community has shrank because of the violence, and who's no longer in
Right.
control because of the violence, because it's often, there's a lot of very complicated factors to that. So I do like that Amber brought that up. You know, sometimes people think because they either fought back or they reacted in a certain way, again, they feel like they're not part of a group that should get support or should get
Right.
services. And I think that's important. If we're going to make our community healthy and safe, we need to make sure everyone is whole and healing and has those resources. And so it is often disparate, I think, that we don't even talk about the perpetrator part of that. And that's scary, because we're not going to make change until that happens.
Yeah,
We can
absolutely
make
not.
all the victims in the world feel empowered, but we're still going to have this problem.
Absolutely.
Like,
And we're still going to have victims if we don't train
Yeah.
and manage our perpetrators.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah.
And like you said, accountability. I mean, I don't think anyone's saying like we just give everybody, you know, hug. I mean, there's accountability that comes along with that. And Amy and New Hanover County, you know, is a big part of that, is understanding that those pieces can be a part of it, but also there's other ways to hold somebody accountable in a relationship, and we have to figure out what works best for each person.
Yeah, and I guess, Amy, in your position, are there, when you are prosecuting, I'm sorry, there's a small echo. I don't know where it's coming from. But when you are prosecuting abusers, do you assist them with, you know, are you also ensuring that a part of their sentence is some type of rehabilitation, counseling, therapy?
So every case is different. Obviously, we're going to treat, depending on the severity of what happened, a little differently. But a lot of cases we do consider, I really listen to what the victim tells me as far as what they know about the offender. But we do usually incorporate, if someone was going to be out on probation or something like that, the domestic violence offenders program, which is what Amber does, I think, the offenders treatment, as well as if the victim says, you know, this is all made worse when this person is drinking or when they're high. Not to say that that is the cause of the domestic violence, but if they notice that that's a trigger for them, that's something important too that we note and can, you know, ask the court to require alcohol monitoring, frequent drug tests, drug treatment assessments, and classes. So those are all tools that we consider when we look at the case as well.
Yeah, that's really important. And it's good for people to know that, you know, we do also care about the abusers too, because they need help. Because a lot of times we focus a lot on the victims and just making sure that they're okay, getting them resources, but there are resources that also need to be funneled to the abusers to kind of help them and maintain some type of rehabilitation.
And I think the frustrating part for me is that we don't have the equality of services for the perpetrator as we do for the victim. So when we receive a client who has come from the court system and we roll through the paperwork and it's like, oh, they got to go to substance abuse, they got to go to this, they got to go to that, where oftentimes for the victim, the services are free. There is an added additional financial burden for the perpetrator, not only to pay their court fees and whatever probation fees they have, but in addition to that, to pay for the drug treatment, to pay for the alcohol treatment, to go to the particular person that they need to see, and our classes cost. And so we don't often have the financial supports that we need for people to properly seek treatment. And oftentimes, if they have been in prison before, are more willing to go back to prison than they are to go pay the money to go to treatment, because if they just put the time in, they could go home without having to do any of that. And so if we had equitable opportunity for service access, I think we would see more people choose that as opposed to going back to jail instead of having to do the time.
But I will say, and I agree, it does cost, and I think that's been built in for a reason, but what we see a lot of is too, like, especially when DSS is involved, a lot of our victims have to do just as many things. And often if the children have been taken, there's not the financial support for some of that.
Right.
There's, you know, and there's not, they don't have health coverage anymore. So they're having to pay for that. And that's been a very big barrier as well. So I think that's a great point, that just those services in general can be very difficult for anyone already in crisis to be able to access. And, you know, I think, again, that part of accountability is this person, like you said, willing to go to these things? Are they willing to engage and really be upfront with their facilitator, their therapist, and really work through those things? And that's something that's really important. And like you said, I think on both sides is really that access to what people need. Go ahead, Amy, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think, Amy, you wanted to jump in? Amy? I think Amy's a little stuck. Okay, Amy, we'll come back to you once you get unstuck. Oh, there you go. Are you unstuck now?
I'm unstuck. I'm sorry, what did I miss?
No, we knew you wanted to say something, so we were trying to get you in. Maybe. It's okay, Amy.
I love meetings on Zoom.
You know, it's okay. Look, technical difficulties. We'll keep going. I did want Andrea to kind of talk about, if people come to your shelter, what kind of services would they expect to receive? What kind of assistance would they expect to receive?
That's a great question. And I will say that we have seen an incredible rise in the need for shelter, just in the community, but also during COVID. We are at over 3 times our capacity right now. But if someone comes into shelter, and even for those in non-shelter, many of these services are available. We do have a court advocate. So I love what you were saying about, it's very confusing with protective orders and criminal court and the differences. So she's not a lawyer, she's not someone who can do that, but what she can do is help navigate the process. And so we have that. We have counseling through a United Way grant. So our counselors with Coastal Horizons Rape Crisis Center, but available, kind of like Amber was saying, no cost, no copay. We can get people in for counseling, which is huge. We have our empowerment group, and we were talking earlier, we are right now doing one-on-one, and that's really sad because you think about people being isolated and really needing those connections. But we're trying to figure out how to safely navigate groups again. There's a lot of resources available in that space. They do not have to pay for their shelter stay. And there's just a lot of staff support for goal planning, safety planning, looking at what their individual needs are. So it's hard to say, you know, if one person needs one thing, you know, we can help with that, and it may be something else. We connect with our community partners like the YWCA for a lot of different things. Carousel Center has an amazing safe parenting group that we do, which really helps people to parent through trauma. And it's, I have more, the couple times I'm like using all the techniques at home. We're doing all the find 5 things that are orange in the room. It makes me a better parent. And I've said that many times, to be able to continually focus on those things. So there's a range of services. They are at a confidential location. So a lot of times people see our open gate office and think that's the shelter, and it's not. That's our admin outreach office. So they can at least expect that we try really hard to maintain confidentiality and safety in any space that we can.
Yeah. And I think it's just important for people in the community to know that your organization is here to help, and that they can find resources with you. So if you're out there watching, need some help, there are many places you can go. And okay, so I would kind of like to end it with 2 questions. So the first question I'm going to ask, what are the top 3 misconceptions about domestic violence? Amber, we'll start with Amber.
I was going to say, Amy, do you want to start?
Yeah, Amy, do you want to start? We got you going now.
I know, I unfroze at just the right moment, huh? So there's in the criminal court system, there, you know, are different misconceptions that I'm sure Amber and Andrea see in their line, just because we kind of deal with people at different points in the process.
Yeah.
But I think one thing is victims tend to internalize this. I put this person in jail. I took out charges. I am the reason they're going to be put on probation, go to prison, something like that. And that's not true. It's the state is proceeding. I'm prosecuting for the state of North Carolina versus John, Jane Doe, whomever. So I think that's important for people to realize. That I think a lot of people internalize that it's all their fault, and it's not. It's the person who offended is the reason why we're all there. Even if they're the ones who called 911, they only did it as a reaction because they needed to get safe in that moment. And then I think a lot of people, when they've been isolated, and I keep saying that word, but when they've been isolated for so long, feel as though there's no one there to help them. And the first thing that happens when they come to like the district attorney's office is a lot of times there's a court advocate from Open Gate somewhere in the courthouse. So we're able to, help them at least get a pamphlet if they can't have a face-to-face with that advocate that day, or they get a referral. There's detectives present. So if there's, if we were speaking to someone about their criminal case and realize, hold on, there's a lot more going on here. We have 2 detectives from the Sheriff's Department and 1 from the Wilmington Police Department present who are ready and willing to help. So there's just so many resources, and that's just only on the criminal side. Out there, there's so many people here willing to help people if they're ready to reach out.
Thank you. Okay, Andrew?
I was going to wait for Amber, but I'll go. I think one of the biggest misconceptions, even just about domestic violence, but also about services, is people think we're there to save or rescue someone. And that is not our role, and that is not what anybody needs. We work with some of the most resilient, strong people that I think we look at and they get misconceptualized as broken or weak, and they're not. They've just been through trauma and they've been through abuse, and they need resources. They don't need a savior. They don't need somebody to swoop in and save the day. They need access to things that will matter in their life. And I think a lot of times people are very well-meaning, but they're like, oh, I want to do this. And when they find that person is not, falling apart, they just really need support. I think it's kind of shocking sometimes. I mean, I couldn't do half the things right now. I'm barely getting out of my pajama pants. I don't think I've dressed up for work in the longest time. And you have people that are coming back from some real trauma. And that says more about who they are for strength than anything I could do.
Yeah. Okay, Miss Amber.
So the question is 3 things, the 3 misconceptions?
Yes.
All right, 3 misconceptions about domestic violence. Only one person can be the victim is a common misconception. A lot of I'm not going to say all, quite a few though, probably a third of my clientele are part of a situation where one person was violent and the other person was violent as well, and that there's a history in the relationship where both parties have been equally as violent to one another. People never think about the idea that 2 perpetrators can be in a relationship as well. And so that's a common misconception that we assume that we should not. Another common misconception is that women are not perpetrators of domestic violence. I teach a men's group, I teach a women's group, and I teach an LGBTQ group, and all of the classes are full. And so it's not just men, and it's not just non-STEM identifying women who participate in violence. It's everyone. And I think we have to make room that the statistic of the stereotypical domestic violence person being a poor, uneducated person who drinks a lot is not always what you're going to see. I'm not going to say that they're not there, but I've had people everywhere from like lawyers all the way down to the garbage man, all the way back up to a doctor, a nurse. So your profession doesn't change your potential to be a perpetrator or a victim. Those are my 3.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you all so much. I think for me, I just learned so much during this conversation. I thank you all for agreeing to participate. I think you all 3 beautiful ladies come from, you are all working to kind of tackle this issue from 3 different angles. And I just think it's important for the community, for people watching, to understand that it does take wraparound services to
Absolutely.
address this issue. And I think that's one of the not I guess one of the things that I've learned through this conversation is it takes victims to be able to have a safe place in the shelter and have resources. It also takes the abuser to have rehabilitation and to gain a stronger toolkit on how to handle whatever emotions, whatever situations that they're happening. And then it also takes a great legal team, whether it's prosecution or defense, to figure out how can we legally make this situation better or settle this situation. And so I want to say thank you. I want to remind everyone to vote. Early voting is happening in North Carolina, but it is important for you to make your voice heard and to get out and vote. And that is important part of the YWCA, not about who you vote for, but just to make sure that you do exercise your right to vote. And then those are my final thoughts. Do any of you ladies have any final thoughts?
I just want to say thank you again. And Amber's going to be stuck with me. I'm going to be calling on her for resources now that I've gotten to know her. I love
connect
having
you
this
too.
conversation.
I will definitely connect you too.
And like I said, Amy is someone we obviously connect with quite a bit, but I mean, works so hard and did a phenomenal job. So it's just been great to be part of the conversation. So thank you for this. And you did an amazing job moderating this.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, you did
thank
a great
you.
job.
I'm
very
awesome.
grateful to have been on a panel with people from different arenas of the work that we do. I don't think I've ever been on a panel that's been this equitable, and I really appreciate you taking the time to make that happen.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. We really, this is one of the reasons why Velva, our CEO, when we kind of sat down about where the YWCA wants to go, we wanted to make sure that we had conversations that may sometimes be hard, may sometimes make people uncomfortable. But what I've learned through some resilience training is just because you are uncomfortable doesn't necessarily mean you are in danger. And these conversations help us to kind of identify these pieces, to help us not be bystanders, to help us understand that you can be friends with someone and y'all work in 2 totally different areas. We have a prosecutor on this call. There's just lots of different meanings and reasons why we have to have conversations, because we build connections and we build understanding. And that's what we do at the YWCA. So thank you all. Y'all all have an amazing night. I owe you all a dinner after COVID. Okay. Well, we can maybe all come together. Oh, say that again.
Were there questions?
Were there questions? Oh, I'm sorry. I forgot about the question part. Let's see. Yes, someone said, are there any services for abused men? And I believe we did answer that. So the answer is yes.
Yeah, we have men in the shelter. We have men that access services. And like Amber said, there's women that access the other spectrum. So it's really what needs do you need met is where we determine which organization makes the most sense.
And the rest of the comments have just been like, thank you so much. Y'all are doing important work. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And more thank yous. So if there are any other questions, or if I get emailed some questions, I will definitely send them out.
Awesome.
All right. Well, everyone have a great night. Thank you all so much.
You guys have a great night.
Thank you.